So I'm delighted to welcome our guests today, our panelists. We have Skye Bergman joining us today from San Luis Obispo in California. We have Jeanette Leardi from Portland, Oregon, and Tessa van Aanhout from Ottawa. And we owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude for being able to join us and taking the time to share perspectives with us today. In a moment, I'm going to let them introduce themselves rather than me introducing them. So let me just tell you very briefly about Top 60. I should remind everybody you should be on mute as well. We're a for-profit social enterprise, which I founded a few years ago to bring attention to the vibrant, healthy, resilient, inspiring adults over the age of 60. We want to help everyone, young and old, understand what it means to age today, and that it's actually a time of growth, learning, and a chance really to reinvest experience with passion and purpose. So we work with businesses and organizations to promote age diversity and educate about ageism. And we also work with individuals to help them overcome their self-limiting beliefs that are caused very much by internalized ageism. We also host sessions such as these, and we have a newsletter, and I know that Ginny has probably put it in the chat by now. Please sign up if you're interested. We'd love to hear from you. And because today is the International Day of Older Persons, we thought it would be appropriate to host an event such as this one, because we know that there are many stereotypes about aging that are unfavorable and also not necessarily true. We've all experienced the negativity, especially through COVID, and we're all growing older every day. This is the era of the 100-year life, where age can really represent potential and not decline. So I'll start with you, Skye. Would you kindly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for hosting this. I'm really grateful to be here, and grateful to be here with Jeanette and Tessa, and it's just wonderful. So I am a filmmaker and photographer, and I taught for 30 years at Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo. I'm a professor emeritus now, and I created a film, Lives Well Lived, which was my first film, where I interviewed 40 people that were 75 plus, with a collective life experience of 3,000 years. And that film has gone on to do pretty well. And it's on PBS right now, and Canopy and iTunes and Amazon. And I'm going to talk more about that, but I think I would like to hand the floor over in the essence of time. So thank you.
Thank you, Skye, for joining us. Tessa, you want to tell us who you are?
Thank you. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me and having me amongst these amazing people. So my name is Tessa van Aanhout. I'm a 17-year-old from Ottawa, Ontario. I'm currently in 12th grade.
Speak up, Tessa.
Okay.
Make sure we can hear you, okay? Yeah, so you're in grade 12. Okay, great. Thank you. Jeanette.
Well, hi, everyone, and it's great. Thank you, Helen, for doing this, and I'm excited to hear what Tessa and Skye have to say. My name is Jeanette Leardi. I am a social gerontologist. I'm 71 years old, and I believe we should all declare our age, not just admit our age, but declare it. We should be proud of whatever age we are. As a social gerontologist, I study how society interprets the aging process and how it affects our life, how those interpretations affect our life. I started out as a writer and editor of educational materials for children, and I worked at magazines in New York City. I'm originally a native New Yorker. You could probably tell from the accent and maybe the speed at which I talk. When I was in my late 40s and early 50s, I became the primary caregiver to both my parents, both simultaneously and consecutively. And I did that for about 10 years. And during that time, I discovered how hard it was to get them the kind of care they wanted and needed. And so once they both passed away, I went back to graduate school at the age of 56 and studied gerontology, went to graduate school for gerontology. And so my mission now is to change people's minds about aging, because there's a lot about aging we get wrong. So I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. Great. So we're going to start off with you, Skye, because you started us off anyway with the kind of question that I wanted to ask you. And again, just to reiterate to the people who've come in perhaps after we started, we're sticking around for about half an hour afterwards to continue the conversation, but keeping in mind that we will formally end at 5:30. So if you don't get a question answered beforehand, I'm going to ask questions, then we'll leave time for you to ask questions. So Skye, one of your major contributions is the film, which you just referenced. Tell us a bit more about, why you chose to document the lives of the people you interviewed, what constitutes a life well lived, and, what were some of the takeaways that you had from the opportunity?
Yeah, sure. I should say, full disclosure, I am 58. I just had a birthday last week, so I am 58. And I really started working on the film, not knowing I was going to do a film, just thought I was going to do this little project because of my grandmother, who you see on that side of me right there. She was my role model and my hero. And she was approaching 100 at the same time that I was approaching 50, which I think that half century mark is really, it kind of, in most people's lives, I think, especially women, we kind of reevaluate what our lives are going to be like and what we're looking at as we're looking forward. And really in the media, I was not seeing anything positive about aging at all. I was seeing all the things that we could do to avoid aging, like anti-aging creams and everything that we could do to stay youthful. And that's not realistic. I wanted to be positive about my aging because I had this amazing role model in my family who was positive and incredible and still worked out at the gym. She started working out when she was 80, so she was still working out at the gym. And I went with her when she was turning 100 and went to film her at the gym. And I came back and put a little video of her together saying her words of wisdom. And I thought, I am going to find other people out there like my grandmother who are positive, who can be my role models. And that was really how the film developed. And we've now done a lot of intergenerational work with the film because that's become my real passion project. But I did want to I'm just going to share my screen really quickly because, today is, as you all know, International Day of Older Persons. And what I found really interesting is that even 10 years later, it hasn't changed. I mean, we are celebrating a day about older people. And what do we think about older people? The first thing we see in most of these is that somebody has a cane in order to be able to be mobile. Now, I mean, that's fine that people do need that, but not everyone does. And I think that we need to counter that stereotype of what aging is, that if you're old, you automatically have a cane. And I mean, that was what I was trying to combat with my film, was showing people who were active, engaged, really had a zest for life, had a sense of purpose no matter what age they were, and that sense of purpose may have changed over time. But I think that that's really important in the way that we speak and the way that we illustrate age. How do we do that? What are the words that we use? What are the images that we show? And how do we connect to younger people so that they understand what we look like and what we are as a group, and remembering that ageism works in both directions, and that we want to be really clear to have a dialogue, a bilateral conversation rather than a one-way conversation, and really talk with people and listen as much as we talk.
Wow, thank you. Was there any one takeaway? Well, I'll get to that in the next question. Hold on.
Okay.
Sorry. And I think I already declared how old I was in the introduction. I'm 74 years old and also proud of those years and the gray hair. Jeanette, I've got a question for you. We entitled this event as a celebration, celebrating longevity. So debunking myths is one of the big goals of today. I know you've done a lot of work on this. I've seen you speak extensively about the various myths and what we need to understand about what it means to age today. Would you please tell us a bit about some of the most egregious myths and help us understand where so many people have gone wrong in their thinking?
Gladly, Helen. That's a great question to start out with, because we basically get aging wrong. We see it very narrowly, and if the biggest myth, I think, is that we believe that aging is nothing but deterioration and decline. It's a process of just getting worse and worse and worse over time, and that's what we've got to look forward to. And while our bodies and brains, our minds do change over time, there are a lot of positive things about it, getting older, which I could talk about later. But we assume that aging is a disease. Aging's not a disease. We're supposed to age. If you're alive right now, you're doing it right, because the alternative is not living. So we need to rethink that aging is something that's natural. We should be doing it. And also that another myth around the concept of deterioration and decline is that people assume that dementia is just inevitable. We're all concerned about dementia even more than we're concerned about heart disease or cancer. It's the number one fear of a lot of people about aging. So let me just bust a myth right away about dementia. First of all, only one, and I'm giving figures that are in the United States, but I'm sure Canada's figures also parallel what I'm about to say. But only 1 to 2% of people ages 65 to 69 have any form of dementia, and there are lots of forms of dementia. Only 1 to 2% have any form of cognitive impairment. As you get into the 90s, people over the age of 90, only 33% have some form of cognitive impairment, which means 2 out of 3 people in their 90s, their brains work absolutely fine. Thank you very much. Now, I'm not talking about the where did I put my car keys business, because we all lose our car keys. And we all start to forget things. In fact, we start to forget things when we're in our late 20s. So this whole concept of a senior moment, well, we lose our car keys and we forget things in our 20s. And even kids and teenagers forget things too. So we need to rethink the fact that aging is something that we just get worse and worse with time. Another big myth is that older adults, we're resistant to change. We're unable to change. We're stuck in our ways. And that could be, nothing is further from the truth than that. When people say that to me, I say, what was a telephone like when you were a kid? What's a telephone like now? If you can handle a rotary phone and now you have a smartphone, you've changed. What was a washing machine like when you were a kid? What was a car like when you were a kid? We are constantly changing. So we older adults not only are constantly changing, we're changing, our bodies are changing, and we are adapting to them, but we are the master changers. If you want to find out what it's like to deal with change on a regular basis, ask an old person, because we experience it more rapidly and more often than other people do. Another big myth is that older adults were a drain on the economy. Again, these are US figures, but right now, older adults 65 and older make up 17% of the American population. Then by 2030, it's going to be 1 in 5 of us. And by 2060, it's going to be 1 in 4 of us. As Helen said before, the world is getting older. This is a global phenomenon. But here's the thing. People in the United States, 50 and older, their consumer spending amounts to 70% of the US gross domestic product. We are majorly contributing to the economy. We're not draining the economy. We are majorly contributing to it. Another big myth is that we older adults are slow learners. We can't really handle technology. Okay, I'm going to bust that myth too. Even though our brains do change, when we are taught in ways that really that really address the changes in our brains, we become as adept as young people in handling technology. In fact, the fastest growing consumer group for laptops are over the age of 65. And a Pew 2019 survey showed that 90% of people ages 65 and older are on at least one social media platform. 90% of us. So we can handle technology. We just need to be taught in ways that suit the ways our brains work. And I can mention that a little bit later. And one other myth is that we older adults are depressed. If there's anything that would depress us, it's the way society sees us. And so we need to change society. But we actually are not as depressed as younger people. In fact, there's something called the U curve of happiness, where people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. And somewhere around the late 40s, early 50s, we experience this dip that we are less happy and less satisfied with life. But then after that, we slowly get to a point where things get better and better. And why does that happen? Because we accumulate experience and we've learned from our experiences, so that when the bad things hit us, they don't hit us as badly emotionally as when we were younger. And I could talk about that later, but that's just a few myths.
Great, great. We know there are more, but those are really significant points that you raised, because I don't know, I can't see everybody, but I saw a lot of the people I can see, I saw heads nodding. So I'm pleased that you mentioned those. Tessa, let's start with you with a simple but complicated question. I want to understand what longevity means to you as a 17-year-old.
I think longevity is definitely, like, the definition of longevity is living a long life in years. But I think through aging, it's not necessarily like you go through your years, but it's more about the accomplishments that you make rather than the years you pass, because you have a lot of time to do plenty of things. And it's not necessarily like, oh, I got through another year. It's, oh, what did I accomplish this year and what made this part of my life important? I think that's a better way to look at it rather than just years going by.
Oh, beautifully said. Thank you. I want to ask you a couple more questions. When I asked you if you would be willing to join this panel, which I think is probably a fairly intimidating exercise, you didn't hesitate for a moment. You said yes. What prompted you to say yes in the first place? And what is it you hope to get out of this?
I just think that we're really promoting talking about important topics, and it's definitely something that isn't talked about enough, especially I find with people in my generation. This is definitely a topic that's absolutely overlooked and not many people think about it. So being able to have somebody with my point of view, being younger, I think it just adds a lot to the conversation, and I can also take away from this things to pass on to other people and to help inform other younger people about subjects like this and the importance of having these conversations and making these connections. I think it's really great.
Great, thank you. You want to tell the group though how we met? Because I met Tessa only once, but I was so impressed with some of her perspectives that I didn't hesitate to ask her about today.
Yeah, so my mother did a PhD about integrating intergenerationalism into communities and how that can be done, things like that. And she did a roundtable discussion in person, and I was sat at a table with Helen, and we were able to have really good discussions about different issues regarding intergenerational relations and how that can be brought into communities and things like that. And since then, and through doing other things, I have been able to work with this subject and also involve myself in it.
Yeah, well, we're very grateful. Thank you. You also mentioned to me once that I misunderstood you. You have your grandparents are no longer living, but they had a profound influence on you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me?
I grew up with two grandparents. The oldest passing away in 2020. And their impact was really long lasting on me. Definitely, I didn't get as many years as I hoped to have with them, but just the love that they showed and the conversations I was able to have with them definitely have a lasting impact on me and have influenced me as a person in, I think, a way that nobody else will ever be able to do. Just the pure, unconditional love that grandparents are able to show is really something that's irreplaceable. And I've definitely realized that.
Thank you. Quite poignant. And I feel similarly. I only had one grandmother who ever survived the Second World War. And she is my role model. Skye, coming back to you now, also in love with your grandmother, but going back to the film, The Lives Well Lived, I'd really like to know some of the common threads that you found when you interviewed or documented these people's lives.
Yeah, well, I think there were really three common threads that the people that I interviewed had. The most important being having a sense of purpose. And what I realized is that that sense of purpose could change over someone's life. That, you know, you might have one sense of purpose when you're in your work life and another sense of purpose when you retire from that work life and do something else in your unretirement, as Rich Eisenberg calls it.
Yeah.
I think that you know, that was something that really hit a nerve for me, because I was looking at retiring from the university and looking at what is the next phase of my life going to look like, and knowing that it can change multiple times throughout your life, I think is really an important gift that I was given when I interviewed all these people. And the other thing is was really helpful when I was going through the pandemic and when I go through some tough times. I interviewed this woman named Evie Justison, who I'm still good friends with to this day. And she talked about Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, being very important. Was out of that was really that there are many times in our lives where we can't control the things that are happening around us, but what we can control is our attitude about how we deal with those things. And I think hearing the stories of the 40 people that I heard and their stories of resilience has really helped me get through some tough times, and looking at life as, you know, the glass is half full rather than half empty, and reminding myself that my attitude and that's huge. And I think lastly is that everyone that I talked to had a really good support system, and it didn't necessarily have to be family. It could be friends. It didn't have to be that they saw them every day, but they just were in touch and they knew that there was a support system, that there were people they could count on if they needed to. And I think knowing that we have that in our lives, that we have that web that we have woven throughout our lives, that gives us that support system, I think is really vitally important.
Yeah, you know, I love what you said, and we'll get to it in a moment too, talking about the various generations. But, you know, when you talk about your good friend, who I imagine is in her 80s or so.
91.
Yeah, and I think it's very possible to have friends, you know, and it's necessary to have friends across the age continuum, because as we get older, those of us who are older, we lose our friends. And so it's really important to know people of different generations as well. Thanks, Skye. Jeanette, maybe you can share with us some of the many things that most people don't know about growing older, that are perhaps worthy of celebrating. I really remember hearing you, and I've never forgotten that talk about the brain. And I see there's also a question there in the chat about it. But can you talk to us a bit about what's good?
Absolutely. This is my favorite thing to talk about, because this stuff hardly anybody ever hears. And every time I talk about the older brain, I tell people, you're my ambassadors now. Please share this information with others of all ages, because we older adults need to feel a boost of confidence about what we actually do know about ourselves, that our brains, really, we have some gifts there. And younger people need to see getting older as something not to dread, but to look forward to. So let me tell you about some of the great assets of the older brain. You probably already know that our brains are what's called plastic. They can change. They change with experience, and they change with acquired knowledge. When our brains change, the idea behind brains changing is that we have all of these neurons, all of these brain cells, and every time you learn something new, you create connections between certain cells. Well, the longer you live and the more you experience and the more you learn, you create all of these super highways in your brain. And so it stands to reason that the older you get, your brain is loaded with these super highways. So that gives us access to more information and gives us the ability to apply that information in all kinds of different ways. So one of the really great assets of the older brain is something called bihemispheric processing. You know that we have a left and right hemisphere. Well, actually, those don't touch except for a bridge of tissue in the middle called the corpus callosum. We're born with that very thin bridge of tissue, and it gets thicker and thicker and thicker until it matures in our 50s. That's when it gets to be the fattest. that it ever gets. And what that means is that it enables us to use both hemispheres of our brain simultaneously better than when we were younger. Of course, we're always using both sides of our brain, no matter how old we are. But when we get into our 50s, and we get to that mature point, we're better able to problem solve from different perspectives because our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere are firing together more easily. And so when we're solving a problem, we don't just see the black and white answers of a problem, the yes or no's. We see the gray areas of life, the what ifs. We see the exceptions to the rule. And that's what makes us very valuable, especially in the workplace, because when we're problem solving and if we're able to be on intergenerational teams, the younger brains can come up with answers pretty fast. What should we do? Let's try this. Let's try that. The older brains can say, that's a good idea, but we may need to look out for this possibility happening. That's the gift of the older brain, is that multi-perspective problem solving. We also have better long-term memories because we have more stuff that we've experienced. It might sound counterintuitive. We might think that, well, younger people haven't lived that long, so shouldn't they have better long-term memories? But the fact is that we have more of these super highways, and so we can access a memory from in many different ways, many different shortcuts than we could when we were younger. So the way I like to explain it is, imagine our brains are like a library. And a healthy 30-year-old brain, let's say, has a library in his or her head of 100,000 books. And you ask that 30-year-old brain, go find me War and Peace, or go find me Huckleberry Finn. Well, the 30-year-old brain is going to go right to the shelf and say, here's War and Peace. There you are. Now, let's say you have a healthy 70-year-old brain, and it has to be healthy. We have to take care of our brains and keep them engaged and challenged. But you ask the 70-year-old brain, go find me War and Peace and go find me Huckleberry Finn. Well, that 70-year-old brain, the library is not 100,000 volumes, but 100 million volumes. Imagine trying to locate a book where the shelves have exploded and you have boxes in the basement. And so it's going to take us longer to get to that book. But the asset of that situation is that the older brain can say, and if you like Huckleberry Finn, I can recommend 20 other books you're going to like. So that's the asset, another asset to the older brain. We're also better at single focus concentration. If we don't get distracted by the environment, by other people, we have more patience to stay on a task longer. Younger people, their brains are hardwired to kind of what's next? It's kind of the are we there yet phenomenon, which is a good thing to have when you're younger because you're constantly foraging for new experiences. Our older brains are more into let's think about this in a little bit greater detail. Let's spend a longer time with it. Also, we have sharper information discrimination abilities. We can tell quicker what piece of information is relevant and what's irrelevant when doing a task. Oh, you don't need to do that step. You could just skip over that step. So we have lifetime experience with finding shortcuts and creating shortcuts. That's another asset of the older brain. And finally, we're much better at regulating our own emotions. Our brains physiologically change so that the low parts of our life don't hit us as hard as when we were much younger. So that we've had experience going through harder times. Believe it or not, studies have shown that through the period of COVID, even though older adults, 90% of all deaths from COVID have happened to people over the age of 65. 90% of all the deaths from COVID happened to older adults. And yet research has shown that older adults have coped with COVID better than younger people have, because we've had this history of my parents went through the Depression. I've gone through lots of trials in my life, so that when something happens, I have a history of, oh, I got through that, I'll get through this as well. So that's another asset of the older brain.
Well, that sums it all up, doesn't it, everybody? I'm watching as people react, and that's exactly how I reacted. I thought, my goodness, we have such a misunderstood brain and intelligence and whatnot. And we really need other people to understand that, especially in the workforce. Jeanette, thank you so much for that. I think there are a lot of smiles going around. Tessa, I have a couple of questions for you again. What are some of the comments that you hear other people your age when they talk about older people?
I think it's something that Jeanette brought up, is that I think younger people have a rather an impression that older people are stuck in their ways, and maybe they'll be judged, or they won't be able to feel like they can fully express themselves, maybe because they worry about being judged because of something that might be newer in our generation, but will be quite a quick change from something that they may have experienced. So I think that's something that can definitely create limits between the generations, because it can cause like a certain amount of unease, I think. And also just young people maybe think that like it might be intimidating to talk to someone that's older than them, just because they don't really know how to go about it, and they didn't really learn as much. Maybe it also depends on how much time you have spent with older people. If you don't necessarily have maybe grandparents or other older people in your immediate circle, it can definitely be a hurdle to get out there and talk with older people if you don't already have the experience from doing that in your own life. Yeah.
Great points, Tessa. I'm just curious, do you think that a lot of young people don't even think about getting older, and when they do, and if they do, they maybe just think about older as, you know, in their 30s or so?
Yeah, I think there is definitely they cut it short a bit. They're like, oh, it's 50, might be something that's like, oh, that's old already. But I guess there isn't really an age where I guess you become old per se, but maybe people think of like quite younger years as like, oh my goodness, I'm so old already. Because I already hear people, they're like 17, they're like, oh my goodness, I feel so old, but they haven't really gotten very far yet. So, but I'm not sure if people think about aging all that much as maybe people think we do.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, you've got more important things to try and focus on at this point. But I think this saying that you're as old today, you're as old as you've ever been and as young as you'll ever be is extremely significant. So for a 17-year-old to say they're old, they are, right? So yeah. Okay, back to you, Skye. This year, I know you were a fellow with Code Generate, and maybe you can tell you know, the group what that is, but you don't have to spend too much time on that. What's most interesting is the project that you undertook, or one of the many projects that you are undertaking ever since you finished documenting the lives of older people, has had to do with a mix of generations. And you've spoken really fondly about the work that you did. And I'd love for you to share that with our guests today.
Sure. Well, I just want to go back to the comment about when are you old?
Yeah.
My dad, who was a geriatric physician from the time he got out of med school, used to say that old is 15 years older than you are, and it's a sliding scale. And I remember when I was working on the film and I was interviewing people, asking them how old is old. And I interviewed my friend's 4.5-year-old son, and he said, oh, 6 is really old. I mean, it is all in your perspective of what old, the definition of old is. I think the biggest thing that we want to talk about more, having the conversation more, is what are those ideas, like when you think of old, what does that mean? And changing the narrative so it becomes the positive things that Jeanette is talking about. So going back to Co-Generate, I was lucky enough to get a fellowship last year. I was part of 15 social entrepreneurs that were working in various different ways to bring generations together to solve things like racial inequality, climate change, social isolation, and more. And that was wonderful. But what I've been doing with the film is connecting older adults and students in high schools and universities. And it started because one of my students went on one of the interviews with me to interview this guy, Lucky Louie, who you're not supposed to have favorites, but he was my favorite in the film. He's such a doll, an Italian guy who makes fresh mozzarella every morning for his daughter's deli. And we finished that interview, and my student turned to me and said, wow, I never knew older people could talk so much. And I was just stunned because I had grown up in an intergenerational household, 4 generations, including my great grandmother. And that thought never even crossed my mind. And so I was lucky enough, where I teach, there's a wonderful professor who teaches a class on the psychology of aging. And we got together to figure out how could we bring this film and how could into her class, because it fit into the class by dispelling a lot of the stereotypical, how could we bring that into class and then connect students with older adults? And so that's what we've been doing for the last 5 years. We've worked with more than 500 students and older adults. And I would say the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway on both sides from the older adults and the students is that they can't believe how much they have in common, and that really the biggest difference is their age, but there's so much that they have in common and so much that they can learn from each other. And the way that we connect the students is that they watch the film, and then there's several questions that I ask in the film, and we give those questions to the students and the older adults as a starting point to begin a conversation, because many times the biggest stumbling block is how do you get to know somebody? And a lot of times just that simple act of sharing stories and being curious about somebody else, that can break down all the barriers, and you all of a sudden you become friends because you learn a little bit about each other. And it's just been an absolutely wonderful, wonderful project to be part of. So I'm really excited because PBS Learning Media picked it up and it's on their website. So educators that are grades 5 through 12 can use it for free along with snippets of the film. And so I hope it becomes a really big movement. There's been a number of high schools and universities across the country in the US that have used it. And that's just been such a joy to see that happen. And I also want to say, you don't have to be part of an educational institution or a community. You can create your own community. One of the things that I've done for, I guess, the last 12 years, except for the COVID years, I started doing a women's dinner the first Monday of every month. And it is women of ages from 20 to 90. And it's a potluck dinner. Everybody has to eat. We all love food. So we come together over food. There's no agenda except to meet each other, to, socialize, to be together, because I feel like the way that we combat those stereotypes, any ism, whether it's racism or ageism, any of those isms, is to know a person from that other group. And then all of a sudden, there's not another group because they are our friend, and it just changes the dynamic. And so my last ladies' dinner, there were 75 people, and literally I had my 20-something-year-old friend there to my 91-year-old friend. And it was just such a joy to see all these people coming together, and they all had something to talk about. They all could find some commonality. And when we break bread, we lose a lot of the inhibitions that we have. So I would encourage you to do that, and even in your own life. That's how you can have more friends of different ages. Just do a potluck and tell your friends to invite their friends. And it's pretty remarkable what can happen.
I muted myself for a change. I've seen a lot of Sky's work, and we talk regularly, and it's always so encouraging to see what she's done. I just want to point out one thing that I experienced. I was asked to speak to a group in a community, and there was a youth advisory. The young people, they were all high school students. They came up to me afterwards and they said, we never heard of ageism. They had no idea that it existed. So it's really important, I think, to spread some of these messages, which leads into, Jeanette, what I wanted to ask you, and that is, some of the examples of ageism. Just quickly tell us how damaging it is, because I know you've done a lot of the research too.
Well, ageism, first of all, younger people may not have heard the term ageism, but I think they have experienced it in one form or another. Sure. And they may have experienced it toward themselves. If they've ever heard an older person say, oh, this younger generation today, isn't respectful, or they're always looking in their phones, or whatever the negative stereotype is, that's ageism. So they may have experienced it themselves, or the 20-year-olds applying for a job and being told you're not experienced enough, we don't want to spend the time training you, which is kind of a ridiculous thing. But then there's there's the older ageism in the workplace, where older people aren't hired because they're too experienced, and that might cost the business more money than they're willing to pay. So the term may be new, but I think all people have experienced one form of ageism or another. But there are different forms of ageism. The first kind is internalized. We can be ageist ourselves toward ourselves. So we may hold ageist views and then even project them onto ourselves. So when somebody says, I can't do this at my age, go on a bike trip, I can't do that at my age, or it's too late for me to learn how. That's an example of internalized ageism. Then there's interpersonal ageism between people. So when older adults are spoken to as if they are children, when they're called sweetie and honey and young lady. I was at in a supermarket checkout counter, and there was a younger person there, and she said to me, "Did you find everything you needed, young lady?" And so I said to her, and you could dispel ageism with humor as well. We don't all have to be serious about it. So I said to her, do you have eye problems? I have gray hair. I'm an old person, and you know what? I'm okay with that. And you can be okay with that too. And she kind of smiled and giggled and all of that. But so that's interpersonal. Or when people buy birthday cards that have black balloons on them because you turned 40, and so all of a sudden the world's come to an end because you're 40 years old, or over the hill cards, all of these over the hill cards. You know what I tell people when they say old people are over the hill? We're not over the hill. We've just reached the top of a particular hill, and when we get to the top of that hill, you know what we see? We see other hills in the distance that are yet to climb. So our climbing days aren't over. We continue to climb. We're the master climbers, just as like we're the master changers. So that's an example of interpersonal ageism. And then there's systemic ageism, and that can be the cruelest of all, because in our systems, in our social systems, a lot of times older adults are invisible or marginalized. For example, sometimes older adults are not included in clinical trials for new medicines. The people in these clinical trials are, middle-aged people. So we have no idea if the same dosage would work for an older person or would be too dangerous for an older person. Our bodies are different. Our bodies are different from midlife bodies, just like midlife bodies are different from children's bodies. We have disciplines called specialists called pediatricians. Well, we older people need more specialists called geriatricians, because our bodies are different. Another form of systemic in healthcare, systemic ageism. As I said, most of the deaths from COVID were for people 65 and older. Think of many of the people in nursing homes who the staff didn't get the equipment, the personal protective gear early on. It was as if nursing homes were just an afterthought. We can experience ageism in terms of gerontocracy. There's a lot of political talk now about how old political leaders should be. Oh, you're too old to run for office. They're confusing age with competence. You can be old and competent. You can be young and incompetent. You can be old and incompetent. Age and competence do not equate. So that's a form of systemic ageism.
Jeanette,
Yeah. Yes.
Here, I just am sharing the screen. Can you see?
There was a cover of the New York, the current cover of the New Yorker magazine. Look at these people in the cover. There's Trump and McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, and look what they're using. And as Sky pointed out, with all of the usage of canes, well, now these people are in walkers, and that's a message that seems to imply that if you're old, you're too old to run for office because you can't even run. You're using walkers in this race. I'm among many people who were infuriated with this cover. And so I wrote a letter to the New Yorker editors. I haven't heard back from them, but I don't know if I will, or if my letter would get published. But if I could be allowed to read what I wrote to the New Yorker, here's what I said. I said, as an older adult and a gerontologist, I'm compelled to say that your cover illustration presents a very serious problem. While it may depict the current ageist zeitgeist, know that editorial decisions like yours, which feed such anti-aging sentiments, usually contribute to that zeitgeist. Too many people are wrongfully concluding that age should be a factor when determining a candidate's fitness to run for or hold office. Competence, not age or physical disability, should be our criterion. The cartoon omits any possibility that what is depicted needs to be criticized. Instead, readers are left assuming that the New Yorker shares the illustrator's prejudiced view. For the sake of promoting our democracy, please be responsible journalists and do a better job. So that's systemic ageism right there. And the media feeds that. And when the media feeds that, people of all ages begin to absorb that ageism. By the way, I appreciated Tessa's comments before. And she's very insightful in the way she describes ageism. Research shows that ageism can be implanted in a child as young as 3 years old.
Mhm.
They can start to hear other people's comments or look at all the commercials on TV or the shows that make fun of old people. And it's interesting that kids who grow up without
on a daily basis.
without ageist views,
Wine.
Please, excuse me, please mute. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
people who grow up to not have as many ageist views, it's usually because they've had a good relationship with an older person at a young age, like Tessa had with her grandparents, and Sky did, and I did. So yeah, intergenerational interaction is what's going to get rid of ageism ultimately.
Thank you, Jeanette. You can see what a what a cheerleader Jeanette is for. That's not a great image, probably it's too young, but for aging and fighting ageism. And we'll talk about that a bit in a moment. Tessa, I want to ask you one more question, and then I have one little question left for all three of you. You know, what would you like older people to know about you and your generation?
I think they should know that we're all on the same team, really. I think that there's a lot of division between us, and we think, oh, these younger kids, as Jeanette also said, like they're always on their phones, they always they're so disconnected.
Mhm.
And I think that's just putting division between us rather than trying to bring us together. It's putting excuses to why you shouldn't try to connect with a younger person. But really, I think we're all just looking for the same sort of connections and things like that. And sure, there might be some difficulty at the start finding connections, but I think if you put in the work and really try to get to know somebody, it shouldn't matter how old they are, and you shouldn't have expectations of who they might be because of a generalization that like, oh, these young kids, they're always on their phones, like their feelings get hurt so quickly if you make a joke or something like that. I find that's a really negative thing that has come up. It's like, oh, young kids can't take jokes anymore. But it's just like sometimes if your jokes are going to be offensive anyways, then maybe it's not the young person that's at fault for getting offended, you know?
Well said. Listen, I know Tessa has to leave in a moment, but I have one last question for her, and then also for Jeanette and for Sky. I'd like you to give us some advice, Tessa. You know, not us per se, but what would you advise, you know, another 15-year-old about growing older, aging?
I think try to live in the moment, enjoy what you're doing. Try to really, especially after COVID and everything, try to enjoy all the things that you can get to do. And also don't get stuck in ruts of like, oh, things aren't great right now, so they're not going to be great later. Like things definitely do get better, and there's good things that are coming later in your further years. So stay positive and stay motivated and put in the work into the important things like school, and put work into your relationships and feed into your positive relationships. Don't feed into things that don't make you happy. You know, it's really, things will get better and things will happen. And, you know, there's so much opportunity that's still to come. If you're a 15-year-old, like there's really so much that is ahead to look forward to.
Are you sure you're only 17? Because I think you are wise beyond your years. Thanks, Tessa. Sky, what would you say to a 50-year-old? What advice would you give a 50-year-old about aging?
I think you know, embrace it. I mean, I think that it's something that I now look forward to rather than dreading. I think that it just embrace the changes, embrace one of the things that I love now is that I don't care what other people think about me. I just do. And I think there's something really liberating about reaching this age and feeling that way, and just really embracing the moment and each and every day. I think that that's you know, it's liberating, actually. I think I fit into that U-shaped curve there that you're talking about, Jeanette, because I just feel like life has gotten better, not worse as I've aged. And I'm looking forward to the next years of my life, and also living in the moment really presently.
Thank you. And Jeanette, briefly, because we have one or two other things that we want to cover before we officially end, and then we'll get to some of the other questions.
Well,
A 70-year-old. I want you to
70-year-old.
advise a 70-year-old.
Yeah, to another 70-year-old, I'd say, do two things. Two things I think that you could do. Think about what you have and to offer and share it. Be proactive. Find a sense of purpose out there, as Sky was talking about. And there are things you know that I guarantee you somebody else would want to learn. Find out who that person is and share it, and then find out what that other person knows and learn it. That's one thing I would advise. Another thing is, think about what society should be doing to provide more respect and opportunities for people of all ages to engage and find a way to get involved and change the cultural landscape for younger people who, after all, are the older adults of the future. So let's change what we all think about aging to improve the lives of older adults today and younger people tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thank you, all three of you, for what you offered there. I just want to bring up one thing before we formally end and before everybody disappears, and that is that we really feel that there's a strong need to bond together to do something about ageism. And so we're putting together a 5-session series for pretty cheaply. We'll have a bunch of people who are advocates and, you know, presenting research and ageism awareness. And we're really looking at mixed age integration. So we'd really like to know if you might be interested in something like that. If you are, please respond to the question on the survey, which will really take you less than a few minutes to respond to. So in closing, I can't thank you enough, the three of you, for the time you've devoted to thinking about the issues that we talked about here today. It's been really insightful. I think everybody, and you can just put a thumbs up if you have your camera on, if you learned something today that you didn't know before, because I certainly have. Again, there's so many things that you brought up, Jeanette, Tessa, and Sky, that were new to me. And I thank you all for being here. And I also thank the people who are online. And now, because I swore that we'd end at 5:30 and I did it, I hope you'll stick around to get some of the answers that you put either in the chat, or we'll have you raise your hand and speak as you ask your question if something has come up. So for those who have to leave us, thanks very much for having joined us today, especially on a Sunday. And Tessa, enjoy your training for lifeguarding.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Bye, Tessa. Thanks. So, Ginny, you consolidated some of the questions. Do you want to help? You know, you're on mute. Ginny, you're on mute.
I should know better. Yeah,
No,
I did. I put them in the chat, and anyone can save the chat if they like.
Yeah.
But some of the questions were: does the medical model promote a lot of stereotypes and myths about aging and disease? And one of the things was, will this presentation be available to attendees later on? Helen, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, we're going to put it on YouTube as soon as we manage to put it together. And so yes, it will be on YouTube.
And how different? Oh, sorry.
No, I just wanted to mention, I saw a number of people who wrote, can you send me the newsletter? No, you have to sign up for it. You have to go to our website and sign up for it. And that's
I've posted that through continually.
I know, I saw that, but I just wanted people to understand. Yeah. Okay.
And somebody else asked, how different is aging based on race? What is the definition of aging other than more years have passed? I think.
Wait, let's stop. Let's stop with the race question. Jeanette or Sky, do you have an answer?
The race question, that's a very good question, because there's an idea called intersectionality. People, we're not just people getting older. We are, people, we all are of a race. We have a gender. We have socioeconomic status or income. We live in different places. So aging will affect us differently depending on all of these other factors. So for example, if you're of a minority and you haven't had educational opportunities or work opportunities, you're not going to have made as much money throughout your life and may not have been able to save as much for retirement. So yes, race is impacted, impacts the aging ability. We have this phrase called successful aging, which seems to place all the responsibility on individuals, but it's really a 50-50 thing. It's what we do for ourselves, exercise and eat well and all of that stuff. But society shares half the responsibility for how we all age. If we're living in an unequal society, societies of inequity, then people are going to age in unequal ways. So that's a really good question.
Thank you. Sky, do you want to add anything?
I would agree with Jeanette. I don't think it's not, based necessarily. Race is one part of it. Socioeconomic is part of it. I think all of this, I think what she said, I would just echo exactly what she said.
Thanks. Ginny, what was the next question?
The next one, what is the definition of aging? Other than more years have just passed.
Sky? Or Sky, do you want to jump in?
I mean, I don't know a specific definition for aging, but we're all aging every day. It's living another day. That's aging. Every day we're aging.
We could talk about
from the
aging
moment you were born.
Yeah.
We could talk about aging from different, according to different definitions. In other words, there's a physiological definition of aging, and it comprises something like 8 different factors. Our cells dying, our immune systems changing over time, and that kind of thing. But then there's aging. We define it, chronological age. When you say how old are you, that's what we mean, chronological age. But then there's functional age, how well you can function and be independent. Take care of your own needs. There are people in their hundreds who are functionally independent or can take care of their own needs, and there are people in their 20s and 30s with serious disabilities. So functional age is a different way of thinking about it. There's the policy age, the official age at which you qualify for, like in the States, Social Security and Medicare. So we define it in all different ways. And then there's these milestones. Are you retired? Are you a grandparent yet? Well, you can be a grandparent at 40. So are you old? If people think, well, you're old if you're a grandparent. Well, what if you're 40 and you had a kid at 20 and then that 20-year-old has had a kid? So aging is a very fluid concept. There are physiological ways to define it, but then there are sociological ways that we pick and choose how we define it.
Thank you.
And there was a question here. It was just before Jeanette told us the answer. What are the changes in the brain? And
yeah.
You gave us a wonderful and I think inspirational message. What is the best way to educate older people to use technology?
Sky, have you come across that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a group called Senior Planet, and that's all that they do is they help older adults and get help in terms of technology. So there are certainly organizations out there that will help. And I think that those are good places to start, places like Senior Planet. And I know that there are local community groups all over that do that. There's also a number of programs where there are students that go into communities with older adults and try and help those older adults. And I think that's wonderful because, again, I love that intergenerational component to it because the students are learning right along with the older adults. They're just learning other things. So there's plenty of resources for that. Yeah.
Jeanette, did you want to add anything?
I agree with Sky, and I noticed in the chat somebody just posted cyberseniors.org. I never heard of that group, but that sounds like a group that could help. And
here in Canada, I'm on an advisory for a group called Connected Canadians, and my 2 young friends, and they're in their 40s, have brought in immigrants who need experience with, with people in order to get jobs. They're refugees or immigrants, and they are going into seniors' residences and whatnot, and working with older people to help them learn how to use, the phone or a tablet. And it's been hugely successful. They're doing really, really well. So there are a number of opportunities out there.
There's a question here. What are the best ways to keep the brain engaged? Are books better than videos, or just learning new information?
This is what I tell people to do. Live your life and constantly kick it up a notch. So whatever you're doing, do it in a more challenging way. People say, well, if you do crossword puzzles, is that good for the brain? Well, if you do crossword puzzles, you get better at doing crossword puzzles. But if you really want to challenge your brain, create a crossword puzzle and give it to somebody else and have them try and solve it. If you like cooking, make up a recipe, try new recipes, try a different ethnic cuisine that you haven't done before. If you travel a lot, and you always rely on maps and GPS, well, if you can afford to not do that, try experiment one day and just go somewhere without looking at a map. And then when it's time to find your way home, then use the GPS and the map. So do whatever you can do, but be more challenged, because when you challenge your brain, you create more super highways in your brain. That's what changes your brain. So do anything you want to do and kick it up a notch constantly. Reading books, if you like reading books, read books of a genre that you haven't read before. If you've never read a science fiction novel, read a science fiction novel. If you've never read a history book, read a history book. Our brains love challenge and they love variety. Those are the two things that'll keep your brain healthy.
Guy?
No, I think you said it well. That's, I always would say if you walk every day, take a different path so that you change it up. And I think, that's a big part of it, is changing it up, not doing this, getting into that same routine all the time, but really doing something a little bit different does engage your brain in a very different and unique way.
I always say, learn something new, learning a new language, for instance. And the other thing that I often say to individuals is, get out of your comfort zone, make a deliberate, intentional move to do something that you never thought you'd do, and be uncomfortable. That really stretches you.
and the most challenging thing you could do is be around other people who are different. Because what's the most challenging tool available to us? Another human being. Because we don't know what that other human being is going to say or do or think. That really helps the brain. So that's why intergenerational and interracial and interreligion, and just, do something different and meet different people. That'll do it too.
Yeah.
Before I go to the last question, there was a comment in the chat. Our medical profession adds to ageism by treating me differently by my age rather than my health needs.
Right.
And I think that's something many of us experience. And the question was,
if I can, Ginny, if I could just interrupt quickly, that is a problem. And that's why we need people who are trained in geriatrics. You don't have to be a geriatrician per se, but you need to be trained in geriatrics, because a lot of times doctors assume that what's wrong with us is because we're old. And we could have problems that we would have had when we were 30. If you have arthritis in your knee, well, the other knee doesn't have arthritis, but they're the same age, as Ashton Applewhite talks about. So it's not so much aging, and don't attribute it to, well, you're old, what should you expect? If you have a doctor who treats you like that, my suggestion is see if you can find another doctor, because or educate the doctor and say, doctor, it's not because I'm old, I'm having a problem. A lot of times it could be sleep deprivation or drug interactions, things that are easily solvable that have nothing to do with age.
But I also want to say, my grandmother, one time when she was in the hospital and I happened to visit her, the doctor came in and the doctor started talking to me and not her. And she was almost 100, but I said, she is the patient, you need to talk to her. And she
Right.
said, "You're fired." And he said, "No, you can't do that." And she said, "Yes, I can." And I just did. And I think that, that is an experience that that doctor will remember. And maybe the next time that he goes into somebody's room who is older, he's not going to look at the number. He's going to look at the patient and talk to the patient rather than somebody else that's in the room. At least find out if that patient is competent and can hear you and understand you. I mean, it was so, I was so proud of her for saying "you're fired" and just sticking up for herself, because it just was horrible the way that he treated her, and no one should be treated that way.
And that's wonderful that she didn't have internalized ageism to think, well, the doctor knows what he's doing and I shouldn't really make any waves or speak up. Good for your grandmother. Boy, I would have liked to have met her.
Yeah.
I think we all would have. She would have been amazing. Thank you. I think we're finished with the questions. Thank you for summarizing those for us, Jeanette, you've patiently been waiting for an opportunity to ask a question. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi there. Thanks, Helen. I'm curious, Guy, what you ran up against when you were putting together content around older people, and what was the appetite like from the media and from producers and funders and so forth, because we're not seen a lot. It's not, it's where ageism shows up a lot, is in media, etc. And so I'm curious how you overcame those barriers and what was your experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that the tide has turned. I mean, I think we see a lot more content about older adults in films, on TV. I'm really grateful of that. I haven't seen The Golden Bachelor. I don't know anything about that, but the tide is turning, and that's great. When I started this project, which was about 12 years ago, no one was going to fund the project. I self-funded it. I rented out rooms in my house through Airbnb, because I've always thought, think outside the box if you can. And I've never let money be the obstacle that has kept me from doing something. But I was also lucky enough to be able to think outside the box and have the rooms that I could rent out. And I wasn't doing, it was a passion project. I wasn't doing it. I purposely didn't have a producer. I did it myself. I released it myself. I thankfully had a really great distributor who got it into theaters. Once it was in theaters, people were amazed. Like, theater owners couldn't believe they held it everywhere that it went. It was held for 9 weeks here in town. It was in Palm Springs for 6 weeks. It was in LA and San Francisco. Everywhere it went, it was held over. So there was obviously a thirst and a need for that. And I think maybe, I was lucky. It had nothing to do with like time. I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to make a film about people 75 plus and it's going to hit the market at just the right time. But it just worked out that way, because I think that now there's so much more about that. And I was thinking about intergenerational work when I was working on the film, and now that has become the big buzzword. So I think I just was a little bit lucky to be ahead of the curve. But also, I have a little post-it note that I'm looking at over my desk. It says, your decisions should be based on your curiosity over fear. And I have always followed that. And so even though I'd never made a film before, I had no idea what I was doing, how I was going to fund it, how I was going to get into theaters, get it on PBS, none of that. I just had a passion that I had to get it out there. And I think if you follow your passion, that is the most important thing that you can do. And boy, my grandmother used to say she wanted to get her 15 minutes of fame, like the Wendy's commercial. There's a woman that would say, "Where's the beef?" And she thought she wanted to be that woman. She has outdone that woman by tenfold, and in a much more positive way. And so I am, thrilled that her message is still getting out there. But I think it's partly because I know it's just a starting point, and I just kept going, and I didn't listen to what other people were saying, and I just followed my passion and my curiosity.
Sky, just to that point, people, and Tessa mentioned it too, and that's what I've always found, is that young people have a really hard time approaching an older person. Unless you set it up, unless it's deliberate, it's very awkward for them. And by the same token, a lot of older people also are very reluctant to, move into the sphere where we find mostly younger people. Can you give us some examples of where you've seen it work really well? I can give some as well, but I'll give you the
Yeah, I mean, I think when it's within the context of like a class situation, or where it's like the students are doing this as part of an assignment, they forget pretty quickly that it's part of an assignment, but they start off that way. I think that's really helpful. I've also seen it. I worked on another project called Forever Voters, where the women from the league, mostly women, although some men, went into high schools and talked to students about voting and the importance of voting, and made them feel included and really talk to them about why their voice mattered. And I think that when you create a situation and a setting where people feel included, that's when it really works. I think that is the key, is making that inclusive sort of feeling. I think, you know, food always helps to get people together, even if you want to do something in a community, where Michael Hebb has this wonderful project called Generations Over Dinner, where people come together over dinner. But then there are specific questions that you have, like a theme or a topic that you're talking about. And that also gets the conversation flowing. I think there's got to be that way that you bring people together and have an opening for people to have a dialogue, because it's not enough just to bring people together. There has to be like a common reason why they're coming together, whether it's for, you know, political change, climate action, you know, all these things. Like I'm writing a book, and one of the chapters is all these really amazing groups that are doing intergenerational work. And there's usually a reason, whether it's like an intergenerational symphony or co-generational housing, there's usually a reason that generations are coming together. And I think that's when it works the best, is that you're all coming together for the common good. And then you meet each other and talk to each other, and just forget about age. And it becomes about my colleague and my cohort who I'm working with.
Right. Thank you. I just wanted to mention that we hosted a series called We Need to Talk, and it was a conversation across generations, and it brought in people from all over the world of all ages. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, it's not unusual. It happens naturally also, and we forget that. I was a high school principal. I worked with children as young as 4 and as old as 19 and a half. My staff were of all different ages. The parents, grandparents were all different ages. The trustees and directors were all different ages. The superintendents, it was the norm. I didn't give it any thought. And in fact, some of the most powerful experiences I've had in my life were inspired by some young people, one of whom suggested that I could go trekking in Nepal the way she did last year. And I did. It never would have occurred to me to do it. But she was the one who encouraged me and sort of held my hand. And so that was one of the things that I pushed myself really far out of my comfort zone, and I went on my own for 2 months. So it was quite something. Anyway, Jeanette, do you have anything to add? Or
Well, I mean, these were all wonderful suggestions. I think Skye gave some great ideas about this, and I agree. If age is not the issue, but something else is the issue, that's a more natural way of bringing people together. We need to keep in mind that we're actually going back in time to the overwhelming amount of our history, because only since the Industrial Revolution did we start to get age segregated, where older people remained on the farms, younger people moved into the cities to work in factories. Then we created the public school system, where kids then would be separated from their families. So think of how age segregated we've been. We've got these 50+ communities. And so when do we, aside from our immediate family, do we actually have contact with, people of different ages? So now we're going back to the time when people lived in the same, not only in the same village, but families, intergenerational families lived in the same hut. So it's about time we get back to what really is natural for us, and that is to be all together as often as possible. That's what's going to break down all of these stereotypes.
also the fact that we're talking about North American culture. There are so many cultures that still also respect their elders and would be shamed if they put a parent in a home or away from them. So, they have completely different reactions, and we have to keep that in mind, especially we're very multicultural up here in Canada. So, and we enjoy that. But you see in those neighborhoods, you see all different generations living and working together. And we relied on the grandparents. I mean, there is one theory out there about why we have grandmothers and grandfathers, and that is because in caveman days, cavewoman days, the women and the men were preoccupied with maintaining themselves and gathering food and making clothing. Who was taking care of the children? The grandparents, you know, whether or not that's true or not, but it certainly makes sense to me. We're coming towards the end of the half hour, and not, we will bring this amazing conversation to its end. I